Massive, unbelievable, gargantuan fraud. A completely rigged and out of control central government. And a out of control and completely rigged and extremely fraudulent Federal Reserve and International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The whole system's rigged. The whole system's bought and paid for. And it's been that way since the late 1600s and early 1700s here in the so-called United States Incorporated. The the federal corporation, the United States Government Incorporated. Now, the proof that I have is the original Albany Corporation, situated just a little bit south, of Van Rensselaer-Wyck and Beaverwyck and all these other Dutch colonial enclaves where the patroons set up their rent land systems. You weren't free men. You were in bondage. You were what were known as bondmen in the early days of New York. The fact of the matter is, the original currency for the United States was pennies, 11 pennyweights of pure copper, 11 pennyweights, which is just a hair over an ounce. So a penny weighed an ounce. So 16 pennies weighed more than a pound. Just 16 pennies weighed more than a pound. Silver coins and gold coins. Well, they've taken all that away. And whose pocket it's in, you can just imagine. Now, folks, fraud and deceit. Fraud and deceit. The original Albany Corporation's lawyers were in the employ of the East Africa Trading Company and the East India Trading Company well into the 1800s, and I believe that some remnants of those slavery connections remain today in Albany, New York. In other words, Andrew John Colvin, A.J. Colvin, the Albany Corporation's attorney in the middle 1800s, and his son, Verplanck Colvin, the great fraud. They were both massively wealthy because of their patroonships. You see, in other words, the Colvins owned massive land grants from the British Crown right next to Van Rensselaer-Wyck, right there just a little bit to the north of Beaverwyck, which became Fort Orange, which became Albany, New York under the English rule. So the lawyers for the Albany Corporation in the middle of the 1800s were lawyers for the East India Corporation and the East Africa Corporation that were massively engaged in swapping and trading in slaves. Men, women, and children, right there in Albany. These are the people that went out and surveyed all their own friends' land, the big grants and the patents, and all over New York State and over in Vermont and Connecticut, and they surveyed their own friends' grants from the British Crown, and worked with people like Alexander Hamilton, who was Andrew Hamilton's son. Andrew Hamilton was a lawyer, extremely well educated at the Temple Church, the Four Inns of Court, Gray's Inn in London, England, and worked in his days as a lawyer for the British Crown. In other words, all of these men that established the Albany Corporation, they're all British agents. Every damn last one of them. And all of that real estate, every damn bit of the real estate that so-called New England, I'm not talking about Old England, I'm talking about New England. All of the land, for the most part, in massive quantities, upwards of 95%, was stolen from the Native Americans. They're new slaves that they demonized and they character assassinated and did everything they could to drag their reputations through the mud to make them look like subhuman and insignificant people that needed to be put into bondage and slavery. And then add insult to injury, they brought all their viruses and bacteria from Europe, and the communicable diseases that the Europeans brought wiped out millions of Native Americans with everything from smallpox to whooping cough to measles, you name it. And then they've gone to work on the rest of us, stealing land from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and then putting everybody in the position of a bond man. Not a free man, but a bond man. And even the freemen had to swear oath and allegiance to the British crown. Even the freemen had to take an oath, a pledge of allegiance to the British throne, to the royals. So this whole common law concept of free man and sovereign citizen is just a bunch of malarkey. It's more of that British common law, hocus pocus, voodoo, sophisms. Look it up, sophisms. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the reason I'm making this particular video is the Coalition of Western States, known as COWS. I didn't make this up. The Coalition of Western States and a whole lot of ranchers are beginning to scream foul on the massive land grabbing, massive millions of acres being grabbed up by the federal corporation. And I assure you, I understand that the United States government is a federal corporation. Just like the Plymouth Company and the Virginia Company and the Carolina Company and the Gloucester Company and all the other British royal companies that were concocted and created using hocus pocus from those lawyers and barristers from Gray's Inn. You see, ladies and gentlemen, they've created a set of rules and they've created massive numbers of laws and statutes and codes and all kinds of regulations and zoning and planning and all kinds of environmental regulation. Millions and millions and millions of laws to put you in slavery. You're a slave to all this crap. And a lot more. What's behind me is just a fraction of it. A small fraction of it. In fact, what's behind me is, I don't know, maybe 5% of it or less. You have been so entangled and snared in law and so-called constitutionalism. I would recommend you take a look at how many different constitutions were in existence before the one that is so famous from 1779, 1782, 1790. There's ones going back decades before 1775 and 1776. You see, ladies and gentlemen, constitutions are simply sort of like the bylaws of a corporation. They call it the social contract, like the Magna Carta, or the Treaty of Winchester, or the Treaty of Assise, or the Treaty of Paris. There's a wonderful one where you got sold down the river. Or the Trans-Pacific Partnership Treaty and Trade Pact, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, or all these other corporate concoctions that put you into slavery. Now, all this land grabbing, this massive land grabbing that's going on all over the United States, and in fact, it's going on all over the world. And it's been going on all over the world since the invention of gunpowder and before. You see, men warred all over Europe for thousands of years before that virus got in a boat and that bacteria and virus made its way to the North American continent. The savages from Great Britain and from Pharaoh's Egypt and from the Middle East and the Far East and the Roman Empire and the Spanish Empire and the French Empire, the European Empire, the Saxons of Saxony, these massively savage and animalistic tribes of Europe had been murdering and killing and grabbing land for a long time, long time before they got in boats and came to North America. And that's the first thing they did when they got here. They started stealing land. Remember the story of Manhattan Island, where the Dutch tried to swindle the Indians for the entire Manhattan Island for $20, $25 worth of beads? You ought to see the massive tracts of land taken for pittance, a mere pittance, pennies per acre. You know, less than 2, 3, 4, 5 cents an acre. And in some cases, well, actually, in most cases, most of it was just bought from somebody who didn't own it, who could make a thumbprint or a scribble with a stick. In other words, most of the Native Americans that supposedly sold land to these big, powerful, and rich friends of Verplanck Colvin and his father, Andrew J. Colvin, and all these other land swindlers associated with His Excellency, Royal Governor Tyron from Carolina, the Carolina Company, you know, who was sent from the Carolinas to Beaverwick, there by Rensselaerwick, to take over right before the American Revolution got underway. The Royal Governor Tyron of the British Empire. Ladies and gentlemen, you have been completely bamboozled and totally flim-flammed and lied to. Nearly everything that they taught you about so-called constitutionalism is nothing but a giant dog and pony show. Bunch of smoke and mirrors. Because you see behind me, folks, and within this massive collection of books that I possess, okay, I've got over 20,000 volumes of law and reporters. The one thing that I know for sure is that in every single of the millions upon millions and millions of cases, there's always lawyers that lose. Every single case has got a bunch of losing lawyers. Every single one. And the other half, now usually who really wins is the bar and the legal profession and then the government and the courts. You think you've got rights? You don't have any rights. You've been lied to. And what you're seeing with these giant land grabs, and let's stop on the land grabbing for just a second. You can't even get the state police and the FBI to be honest about the gunning down of Robert Lavoie Finnegans. I don't know about you, but when you're standing within 100 feet of a man getting shot to shit over and over and over, there's shots popping off left and right. I mean, the Oregon State Police can't even be honest about how many lethal versus non-lethal, and we weren't shooting at him, and he had his hands in the air, and then, he dropped his hands. You take a freaking big caliber bullet in the back, traversing, diagonally across your guts, and then exiting out the left side right below your rib cage. That's going to make you drop your hands. That one hurt. That one hurt a lot. It ripped tissue all the way through on a diagonal transverse trajectory across Robert Lavoie Fettigum's lower abdomen. Of course he dropped his hands, and certainly he'd reached for the exit wound. He'd been gut shot through the back. But the state police lied to everybody. And the FBI lied to everybody. And they're lying about everything else too. Because I got news for people. That so-called public land, where the hell did the United States get that public land? Exactly. Well, they buy it from Russia? Well, they bought it from Russia. They bought it from Russia, but what did Russia own? Did Russia really own it? And how did Russia get it? Where did Russia get the land? Did they steal it? And the answer is yes, they did. They stole it. Russia stole it. Same with Alaska. Alaska was stolen from Russia. And it's the same old garbage that came over from Europe, just going west and connecting back to the Asian continent in Europe. Going around the world. All this land grabbing and swindling crap. Massive amounts of it began at the Biltmore Castle, the Masonic temple at the Biltmore, with the Vanderbilts and the DuPonts and the Peabodys and the Morgans and the Astors and the Rockefellers and the Delanos and the whole little mafia gang, the massively wealthy industrialists that began this national forest preserve crap. The land grabbing by the environmentalists began mostly at Biltmore Castle in Asheville, North Carolina, and then they, moved it up into the Adirondacks, and, then they went west, and then they started grabbing stuff all over the world in the name of biosphere and environmental conservation, royal forest set-asides. You see this grabbing up forest land and setting it aside for the hoity-toity 1%, and to make money off it, and to harvest the timber and harvest the gems and the jewels and the gas and the silver and the ores and the coppers and the uranium and the thorium and all the massive amounts of money, the treasure that they dig out of the ground, and all the timber and the paper and the water and the fancy, subdivision lots and the massively opulent places to build mansions and all the real estate. This real estate land grabbing bankster, gangster, swindle, Ponzi con has been going on in the United States since the white people showed up. And that includes the people that went out and so-called homesteaded the West. Because precisely what is it that they homesteaded? And whose land was it in the first place? I mean, you cannot take possession of stolen property and say it's yours. Because it's stolen. That's all there is to it. And we're not talking ancient history here. We're not talking 4,000 or 5,000 years ago when God gave all of Palestine to the Israelites. That big battle and war and that never-ending warfare going on in Israel today. The Israelis, the Jews against the Palestinians over God gave us this land. Everybody supports Israel, right? Well, why is that? Why does everybody support Israel? And then you've got to, examine it against the backdrop of what about the Native Americans that lived here, the First Nations? What about them? They don't count? They're babies and their children and their grandmas and their grandpas and their husbands and brothers and wives and sisters. They just don't count? Because they're Indians and they're savages. I'll tell you who the savages are. That'd be these Gray's Inn Four-Inns of Court. Gray's Inn Four-Inns of Court, Temple Church of London. All the lawyers from that freaking mafia. There's your savages. And all the other savages all over Europe that have been warring and killing and murdering and carrying on like a bunch of crazed animals over real estate and territory and wealth in Europe for thousands of years before they showed up in the Americas. There's your savages. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I'll leave it right there. To the Bundys, the Hammonds, and the Finnegans, it didn't start in Arizona or Oregon or Nevada. This giant mess, this massive, unbelievable corruption by the General Land Office and the BLM and the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Revenue Collection Service and the U.S. Treasury and the IRS and this giant land confiscation incorporated, it did not start in the West. It started long before they crossed the Mississippi River. Hell, it started before they crossed the Ohio River. Actually, it began along the Connecticut and Hudson rivers in New England and along the Chesapeake Bay. Yup, and the Potomac River. Long before all the Indian territories were stolen. You see, that was all Indian land out there. It didn't belong to Russians. It was all Indian land. To the Finnegans family, I express my deepest condolences. The man had his hands up. And the FBI, well, they just kept right on shooting anyways. And the Oregon State Police lied about it. Yeah, and Sheriff Grassley, or Ward, or Judge Grassley and Ward, they lied about it. All kinds of people lied about it. All the major corporate news media, the corporate news media in the United States, they lied about it too. I don't know what more to say. They're busted. They're exposed. And this idea that, oh, we only fired 2 shots that we didn't admit to, the answer is, oh, baloney. You can hear shot after shot after shot after shot, shot after shot after shot. They shot 25, 30 times at least. You can hear it popping off like crazy. They shot twice they didn't admit to. What a... Hey, I got some beachfront property for you there in the Everglades swamp. Yeah, I got some beachfront swamp to sell you. Folks, that's it for today. That's where I'm leaving it. God bless. And as always, hasta la vista. We'll be back.